Thank you so much for joining me today. We're here with my close friend, Evan Abramsky. To be honest, I've only known him about 6 months, maybe a year, but I feel like we've grown a really great connection. I've met up with him pretty much every time I go to Washington, D.C., whether it's for work or to see friends, and he's become an important part of my life. I'll often consult with him about issues that have to do with economics or politics. I think he's all around one of the more well-rounded individuals that I've met. Evan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Ari. I really appreciate that. And yeah, it's while we've only met a few months ago, I feel like I've gotten to know you really well since then, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you about anything policy relevant or otherwise.
Now, you're a researcher. You do research at the American Enterprise Institute.
That's right.
I assume you're working from home right now?
That is indeed true. Yes. I had to bring my bed all the way back from my other office, so this is not my office though.
Now, what's the working scene? How are you managing? Are you able to keep up to date with projects? Has the material changed actually?
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot more research focused on China's challenges for the global order. I think since the coronavirus outbreak, there are a lot of folks at AEI who are quite concerned about China's complicity in this pandemic, and so I think they're trying to take advantage of the situation to reinforce some of their talking points and arguments from the last year or so about China's growing aggression on the international stage, and also its systematic efforts to subvert some institutions that have been built over the last 40 or 50, 60 years by the US and its allies. So there's been a lot more work focused on China. There's been a lot of work also focused on the coronavirus, of course, itself, and its implications for international security and international economics in the coming years.
So one of the things that I find interesting about the American Enterprise Institute and the reputation is that oftentimes it gets lumped in with conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C. And well, I think there's a level of truth to that. There's a level of fiscal responsibility that maybe underlies some of the efforts, some of the agenda of the American Enterprise Institute. In many ways, it seems leagues far different than places like the Heritage Foundation, right? So when we're talking about a focus on China for research, what are some of the underlying expressions, the underlying emotions of why American Enterprise Institute is focusing there?
Yeah, I think ultimately the American Enterprise Institute believes first and foremost in the importance of free markets and an international trade, international free trade for the long-term growth of the global economy. And so when we're talking about issues related to foreign policy in China, that's a current that's always sort of underneath the surface. There are a lot of folks who are concerned about China's implications for national security, especially in the South China Sea and increasingly in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world now through the One Belt, One Road initiative. But the scholars who focus on these issues are also keenly aware of China's position in global foreign supply chains and the importance of making sure that any foreign policy that we decide to pursue in regard to China is not so disruptive that it ends up costing American consumers and the American government in any unanticipated ways. So, to put it in another way, we are not an isolationist think tank by any means, and not many of our scholars, I would say, fall into that category. They are just trying to get people to recognize that there are costs here that we did not anticipate when we began to engage with China 40 or 50 years ago that we're going to have to come to grips with. And that doesn't mean we need to completely remove ourselves from China and try to remove our supply chains from there. But we do need to do something to make sure that we are not completely beholden to Chinese domestic policy and foreign policy in the future, should another instance like this pandemic arise.
Now, there are large questions about the implications of globalism, interconnectivity when it comes to the coronavirus. But something that I'm specifically interested in is the question of communism uh, on a larger scale. I'm not necessarily so willing and so quick to implicate China as a cultural unit, Confucianism, for example, but I am more concerned about the question of the spread of reliable information, the free flow of information. So even though I have concerns about a stressed economy, an economy that doesn't necessarily feel like it has free growth, the thing that more concerns me is that free flow of information. We saw at the beginning of the outbreak in China, in Wuhan, a number of doctors tried to petition their own government to get information released on this, and then try to go out to media sources. They were quickly put down, made to retract their statements. And even in the United States, if a doctor approached the government and told them that this virus was starting to spread, the government may still shut him down. But the difference is in the United States, we have the ability for doctors to reach out directly to the press without repercussions. Now, are we implicating communism as a whole? Is this just a reality? Is it an externality? Is it an eventuality? Where does that fall?
So I definitely think that China's domestic policy towards the free flow of information is absolutely complicit in the spread of this outbreak throughout China and then later into the rest of the world. However, I think it's a highly complicated situation for a couple of reasons. One, to get to your point about communism in general, I would say that the system that was built in China, the system of government, was founded initially almost as a complete replica of the Soviet system. It is a Leninist system that is designed to soak up as much information and pull it upwards to the top and give as little back as possible in the form of broader information or aggregated information. So the data, ultimately, the folks at the top of the Communist Party in China are interested in getting quality data. They're just not going to give it back if that's what they get. But at the same time, they've created a system that incentivizes their lower level cadres to provide very rosy pictures of what's going on down below. So there is this inherent tension in the system that this creates. And you could see it in the situation with Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, which has been compared to plenty of times. And it's a pretty similar situation now. We're not entirely sure how much the Politburo knew about the scope of this virus late last year. By the middle of January, it was clear that they had come to grips with the fact that this was a very severe threat to the country's public health. But early on, there's ample evidence that local officials in Wuhan were more concerned about their political survival than the survival of their constituents. And they worked hard to make sure that no bad information made it to the emperor in Beijing. And so this is sort of the inherent tension in a lot of communist systems that are based on a Leninist style system of government. I don't know enough about other officially communist states to be able to speak on them, but I know for sure this was the case in the Soviet Union, and there's a very similar dynamic now in the People's Republic of China.
Now, one of the other things that I think we could maybe get into at a different date is wages in China and how it's become more difficult to sustain those wages. I know that there's been a flow of job opportunities into Vietnam, for example, which is in itself also a communist state. Now, I think it deserves a bit of attention to say, all right, if our supply chains leave China, where are they going? And are the places that they're going to go that much better? Let's say they go to Vietnam, or let's say they go to the Philippines, where the health system isn't completely strong there. Duterte has his own dictatorial tendencies, even though I don't think I would quite call him a dictator at this point.
Right.
Yeah, can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, so I think it certainly seems likely that countries like Vietnam, Mexico, perhaps Malaysia and some other countries in Southeast Asia and in Latin America could benefit from the exit of supply chains from China. However, I do not believe, and I don't think many economists believe, that those countries have the capacity to be able to supply nearly the amount of output that China has over the last decade. It would take a very long time for them to be able to build up sufficient capacity. And it would take an immense amount of investment, not just from companies looking to relocate their supply chains, but also from the governments themselves. A lot of them don't have the infrastructure that China does. I mean, something like 40% of Chinese GDP is the equivalent of 40% of Chinese GDP is invested every year. Those countries don't have those sort of investment levels, and it would take a long time for those investments to bear fruit. So we're talking about maybe a long to medium term change in supply chains, a relocation from China, but we're not looking at anything like that in the next few years. It's going to be a relatively gradual and slow process. I do think that when it comes to U.S. firms, the country that would be more likely to benefit from the relocation of supply chains out of China would be Mexico, given that Mexico already has a relatively developed industrial base and has the ability, has a relatively stable government, or at least has had a relatively stable government since 2000. So I think there are a lot of problems in all those countries, like you mentioned, and it's not clear if relocating all of our supply chains out of China into them would make for a more stable, reliable system. But for now, it certainly seems that there's appetite to try and diversify our sources of things like medicines and some rare earth minerals and other important inputs for production.
Now, this is probably a good transition to acknowledge the fact that you're in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
It's an industry hub of government. It's an industry hub of supposedly getting things done, right? The gears need to continue to grind.
That's right.
They need to keep moving. I'm sure the administration, the White House, the legislature to some extent, they're still in movement. Now, are you seeing people out on the streets in Washington, D.C.? Are you seeing people ambulating?
Yeah, there's actually still a fair amount of activity outside. Most federal workers are home at this point, but there's still plenty of activity. A lot of folks are going out for runs, walking their dog, going to the grocery store. Masks have become far more common on folks, which is a good sign. And generally, traffic is much lighter than it used to be. But there's still ample activity outside. There are a lot of folks who are still going out to get takeout. I myself have gone out a couple times to get a breakfast sandwich down the street. So I think it's hard to get folks to stay cooped up for this long. I mean, at this point, I haven't really heard of anyone being forced home in any kind of, I haven't heard of any enforcement action by police to get folks back at home. So I think a lot of it is sort of voluntary at this point, de facto, and it's really hard to get folks to de facto enforce a stay-at-home order. Everyone gets antsy and wants to go out for at least a walk. I don't know if that's having an impact in terms of the spread of the coronavirus at this point, but DC's numbers have certainly continued to grow, and so that is somewhat concerning.